Hi there, I'm Beth, and I'm back this week with another sewing pattern and tutorial for the Smart Doll guys. This week I'll be showing you how to make a long-sleeved Henley shirt. I've already digitized the pattern and you'll find it available to buy at bethramsden.com. Supporters of my Patreon will be getting this pattern for free. Print your pattern pieces at 100% and cut them out. Cut out the Henley front piece like so. For this project, I recommend using a lightweight, stretchy jersey fabric. It's a great project to recycle an old t-shirt from. When you're tracing your pieces onto the wrong side of the fabric, make sure the most stretch of the fabric is going widthways across the pieces, so from left to right. A 7mm or 1/4 inch seam allowance is included in the template pieces, so just trace round them and cut out on the line. I copy over the markings from the template pieces to the wrong side of the fabric pieces, with the exception of the placket piece, which I align right sides together with the front piece. I'll pin it in place and then stitch along this outline with a small stretch stitch, and will then cut out along the centre in the way marked on the pattern piece. I've actually hand stitched this, but of course it can be machine stitched. The whole Henley top could be hand stitched if you like. I would recommend using a back stitch because it allows for a little stretch which will move with the jersey fabric. Here I cut down the centre and into the corners of this shape we've stitched, allowing the placket piece to be flipped to the garment's wrong side. The jersey has a tendency to curl up and be a little unruly, so once I've got it in place, I give it a quick press with the iron. Then, with the seam allowance here tucked in towards the centre, I fold one side of the placket piece in towards the centre and back out. It should be just the right size, that a little fabric extends beyond the seam line we previously stitched. You could press or use fusible interfacing like trouser hem webbing to hold this into place until it can be top stitched in the ditch from the garment's right side, making sure the seam isn't overly visible. Here I've hand stitched just one side of the placket, and you can see a couple mil extends beyond the seam line. Pinning the bottom of the seam allowance out of the way for the moment, I'll then fold in and back on itself the other side of the placket before hand stitching using a back stitch. It is possible to use a straight stitch for this at the machine, since this area shouldn't be getting stretched as the doll is wearing it anyway. And finally, I stitch in the ditch across the bottom of the placket here. If you find the bottom seam allowance is too bulky, you can trim away some of the excess, and from the right side of the garment can stitch in a little V shape to hold everything neatly and add a little more decoration to the front. Give the placket area a little press if needed, and then bring the right side of the front and back pieces together, aligning them at the shoulder seams, and then stitching at the machine, or again hand stitching. Next, we'll finish off the neckline. For a nice finish, I recommend overlocking the marked edge on the binding piece here. With that done, I bring right sides together, aligning the raw edges of the binding and the neckline, but allowing a 1/4 inch to protrude beyond the placket opening, which I wrap around back on itself towards the inside. I pin that into place and then at the machine we'll start stitching 7mm or 1/4 inch in from the raw edge, pulling gently on the binding piece as I go. The binding piece should be long enough to get all the way around the neckline and leave at least a 1/4 inch protruding off the edge of the placket, which can then be wrapped around and stitched into place as we finish this seam. If you pull it a little more, or if your fabric has a bit more stretch, you might have a little excess to cut away before finishing this seam. I had a little bit to cut off here, and as you can see, the wraparound at each end means we have a nicely finished edge when the binding piece is pulled up. With the seam allowance of the neckline oriented up into the collar, I tuck in the seam allowance at the placket edges and fold the binding piece over onto itself, enclosing the seam allowance and extending just a little beyond the neckline seam. I'm careful to pin and catch the end of this seam on the inside before I top stitch in the ditch again all the way around the collar. Again, this can be done with a stretch stitch, or if you're very careful, with a straight stitch. Here mine is done, and if you have any untidiness or if your seam allowance is sticking out a little, don't be afraid to take a needle and thread and use a ladder stitch or whip stitch to secure these edges together. I've also included my little label at the back of the collar here. Next we will insert the sleeves. So with right sides together, I align at the center point and at either end before pinning the rest of the seam and stitching at the machine. We can also overlock and turn up by a 1/4 inch to the inside, the sleeve cuff and top stitch. Here my sleeve has been stitched in using a stretch stitch, since the seam will probably get stretched and pulled a lot when it's getting pulled onto the doll. I'm going to neaten up and trim some of the excess seam allowance before overlocking the edge for neatness. And here's how my cuffs look as well. I've done 2 rows of top stitching. Here's how my Henley top is looking so far, and with the shoulder seam pointed in towards the body, I'll fold along the sleeve and bring right sides together, matching up the cuffs and the bottom hem and the armpits, before sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance from the cuff to the hem at each side of the body, trimming and overlocking the seam once stitched. Now here's something new to me. A thread pig or thread rat or leader is a little scrap of fabric used at the start of a seam to catch the sort of rough part of thread that's often at the start of machine seams. I know my machine, if I'm not holding on to the end of the thread as I start a seam, will have a kind of untidy mess on the underside of the fabric. So you can start your stitch on the thread pig before continuing on to your proper piece of sewing. So here I'm sewing a stretch stitch along my side seam, and then I'm also using a thread pig at the end here as well. Not sure that's really necessary, but it does mean that I don't have little loose ends of thread floating about on my worktop because they're caught in the thread pig. So you just have to trim them away at the end, and all your loose bits of thread are kept in the fabric. I think I'll be trying this method from time to time. So here's how the top is looking so far. I've trimmed a little and overlocked those side seams. And another one of those little finishing touches that I like to do is to press in towards the body the top of the shoulder seam, and with a couple of little hand stitches just tack that onto the seam allowance of the shoulder itself. So this means that your seam allowance is kind of manually held into place. Now for the bottom hem here, I'm going to overlock the edge. I'm going to turn it in by 1/4 inch, and again I will top stitch 2 times for me the bottom hem to finish it off. I'm going to press a couple of these seams just to finish them off neatly, but yet another finishing touch I like to do is to hand stitch the seam allowance of the sleeve cuff towards the back of the garment and just stitch it to the seam allowance of the cuff itself. Again, just a nice finishing touch to have everything held in place properly. You might have seen my little ironing helper here, the padded shape that I put inside a garment when I'm pressing seams. It just helps me ironing these fiddly seams. And press it with a wooden clapper to take the heat out quickly, and it gives you a nice crisp edge. One last tip here, if like me you use heat erasable pens for your sewing markings. If you have a hairdryer or a small heat gun like this, you can use it to blow on the fabric and it will erase all those markings. And there we have it. You should have one finished Henley top for your Smart Doll guys. I've made a few of these now and really like the style. I think it suits them very well. Another way you could finish this off is to add snap fastenings to the front of the placket. That could be a nice touch, or even buttons. And here's my light pink Henley top that I've made for my guy today. I think they look nice with the sleeves rolled up a little bit as well. Show off those arms. So before I go, I just want to say a huge thank you to all my supporters over on Patreon. Again, they'll be getting this pattern for free as part of their paid membership at any level. You'll find the pattern available at bethramsden.com. Be sure to check out the shop as a whole because I've added a few prototype garments and other bits and bobs that have never been listed on there before, so do check it out. I might even list a couple of these ready-made Henley tops there as well as potentially some of those shirts from last week. So check them out, bethramsden.com, and I hope you've enjoyed today's video. Please leave a like if you have enjoyed it and a comment below. Let me know what you think of this week's project and if you're going to try making one yourself. Thanks so much for watching. I did notice that my channel has now exceeded 20,000 subscribers, so I will have to come up with a way to celebrate, so watch this space. Thank you, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.